Honourable Member for Halifax.
Oh, goodness. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Sorry, I'm caught a little unawares. I thought there was someone who was before me. Let me just grab my notes. Thank you very much. I'm very proud to speak to my colleague's motion, the member from Nanaimo Cowichan, to actually expand the scope of Bill C-3 so that a grandchild born before 1985 with a female grandparent would receive the same entitlement to status as a grandchild of a male grandparent born in the same period. Madam Speaker, there are a few problems with Bill C-3. For example, there is its attempt in Section 9 to actually take away the right to sue. It's a bit problematic. We've had some witnesses come forward and say, you know, we really need to relook at this section. Also, the way, when this does come down, there are quite a number of witnesses who are concerned about the fact that there may not be the resources to actually process applications in a timely way. We saw that when C-31 was enacted, and so that's another area that there is a bit of a problem and we need to look at. But this motion that we're speaking to deals directly with the fact that under C-3, despite the government's attempt to address gender discrimination as a response to the McIver decision, there is still gender discrimination in the bill that is brought forward. And if I can just grab my notes, which there was a good submission or a good quote from the Assembly of First Nations specifically about this. And I'm struggling to find it, Madam Speaker. Anyway, AFN has actually said that all this does is it defers the discrimination to 1 or 2 generations later, and it entrenches differential treatment of women. Of course, AFN is concerned with the other problems like increased financial pressure and creating divisions within some communities and families and declining status. But back to our motion, AFN is very clear that C-3 doesn't adequately deal with differential treatment of women. By way of a quick overview of this situation, as we all know, this stems from a case, Sharon McIver, that she brought forward. Ms. McIver was born in 1948 and was not a registered Indian. She married a non-Indian in 1970. Ms. McIver did not believe that she was entitled to status under the Indian Act, but regardless, she would have lost her right to status under the Indian Act when she married a non-Indian. So when Bill C-31 came into force in 1985, she applied for Indian status on behalf of her and her children. This was an incredibly long process, but after years she obtained Indian status. But her son, Jacob Grismer, was not able to pass his status on to his children because his wife was not a status Indian. So Mr. Grismer and Ms. McIver challenged the 1985 amendments to the Indian Act on the basis that the status provisions contained residual discrimination based on sex. So they won their case at the BC Court of Appeal, but even though they won their case, we still find ourselves standing here in the House of Commons debating the same issue, what is essentially the same issue, residual discrimination based on sex. So let's look at the government response to the McIver decision. There was a really good presentation done by the Canadian Bar Association at committee, and it sort of encapsulated what the government response was. And so the federal government scheduled several sessions with national and regional Aboriginal organizations, and they accepted written comments prior to the introduction of Bill C-3. And what happened was they've come up with this bill that the main amendment, really, there are quite a few pieces, but the main amendment proposes the addition of Section 6 sub 1 sub C.1 to the Indian Act, and it would provide status to any individual whose mother lost Indian status upon marrying a non-Indian man, whose father is a non-Indian, who was born after the mother lost Indian status but before April 17, 1985, unless the individual's parents married each other prior to that date, and who had a child with a non-Indian on or after September 4th, 1951. So first of all, one thing that the CBA pointed out was it's actually a bit puzzling that you have to have a child for this to be triggered. So it seems that there is a little bit of discrimination there based on family status, because you actually do have to have a child to fall under this section of the Act, which is a bit odd, to say the least. So if we look at what this actually does, what this actually means, again, back to the CBA brief, they put together an excellent chart because, conceptually this might be a hard thing to think about. It may be hard to sort of navigate in your mind. What does this mean in reality? But it's not actually rocket science. It is pretty clear if you can wrap your head around the concepts. And the CBA has put together this beautiful chart listing this proposed amendment by Bill C-3. And they've got two examples. So they've got Sharon McIver, married to a non-Indian man, and a hypothetical brother who was married to a non-Indian woman. And if you follow this chart down and see what happens to their children and see what happens to their grandchildren, whether or not they have status, it's with these changes, C3, the bulk of the situations actually are the same. That's great. So there isn't any discrimination. So her son, married to a non-Indian woman, has status. The hypothetical brother married to a non-Indian woman, that son has status, so great, we're all on par there. So Sharon's grandchild, born after 1985, has status, great. The hypothetical brother's grandchild, born after 1985, has status. Again, everything's on the up and up. But this is where it actually comes a bit off the rails. Sharon McIver's grandchild born before 1985. No status and continuing discrimination. But if we look at the hypothetical brother, who has a grandchild born before 1985, that grandchild has status. So we're not talking about strange, adverse effects discrimination that's hard to figure out, differential impact. We're not talking about hidden discrimination, or this is overt. I mean, if you follow the lineage, so the grandchild of the brother gets status, the grandchild of the sister doesn't. So it's pretty straightforward if you think about it that way. Now, I'd actually like to read from a submission of the Grand Council of the Wabanaki Nation. They put together a great submission about the siblings rule, and they actually give a different situation. So we have Susan McIver, and they talk about a woman named Susan Yantha. Pardon me. Susan Yantha was born in 1954 from a common law union between Clement Obamaswin, an Abenaki affiliated with the community of Odanak, and Anita Paradis, a non-Indian. At the time of her birth, the Indian registration rules did not allow for the registration of, quote, illegitimate daughters of an Indian father and a non-Indian mother. At the beginning of the 1970s, Susan married a non-Indian with whom she had a daughter, Tammy. Born from non-status parents, Tammy obviously had no right to be registered in the Indian Register at the time of her birth. In 1985, the federal government adopted Bill C-31 in a stated effort to eliminate discriminatory registration rules from the Indian Act. Pursuant to the new rules, Susan only had a right to 6 sub 2, quote, non-transmissible status because she only had one Indian parent, her father. As a result, her daughter Tammy had no right to be registered. It goes without saying that Tammy's daughter, now aged 4, has no right to be registered either. Let us compare Susan's situation and that of her descendants to that of a hypothetical brother of Susan, born in the same circumstances, and the situation of his descendants. That brother, whom we will call Arthur, would have the right to be registered at the time of his birth since the Indian registration rules. While they did not allow for the registration of, quote, illegitimate daughters of an Indian father and non-Indian mother, they did allow for the registration of their, quote, illegitimate sons. Supposing that Arthur married a non-Indian like Susan did, his wife would have acquired Indian status by marriage. Had Arthur and his wife had a child at the same time that Tammy was born, that child would have had the right to Indian status as a legitimate child of the status male, but would have lost that status upon reaching the age of 21 years because of the double mother rule. With Bill C-31, Arthur, his wife, and their child would have each been conferred transmissible 6 sub 1 status in 1985. The goal of Bill C-31 being also to preserve the, quote, vested rights of those who had Indian status at the time of the new rules were introduced. As to Arthur's child, his status would have not only been preserved, but also enhanced, since under the new rules he would have enjoyed status indefinitely, and not only until the age of 21, and could have passed on his status. As a result, the child of Arthur, or Arthur's grandchild, would have the right to non-transmissible 6-2 status. This blatantly discriminatory treatment was described by the Minister of Indian Affairs himself in a letter written to Susan Yantha in 2002. So that's, as I said, that was a submission of the Grand Council of the Wabanaki Nation. And so it's pretty obvious that there is discrimination. I think also, if I can be bold, if I can be blunt, it is obvious that there is a solution here. There's a very real solution, and it's right there in front of us. We haven't had changes to the Indian Act concerning this issue since 1985, and here we are. And it's the golden opportunity in 2010 to make sure that the Act doesn't discriminate against any women who fall under the Indian Act. And yet we have a solution that's been brought forward by government that is so narrow in its scope. All it does is address the injustice that Sharon McIver herself found herself in. But what we're going to have to deal with 25 years from now is actually addressing the injustice that the next Sharon McIver in a different situation will have experienced. So I'd like to talk about solutions, and my colleague from Labrador was actually talking about how at committee we have had witness after witness who has come forward to say, well, we know how to fix this. We have had witness after witness saying, you know, there are some problems with funding, you know, how are we going to process these applications? Yes, there's a problem with Section 9, but at the very least, can we at least get the discrimination piece right? There was a submission made by LEAF, which is the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, and they've been following this case along through its entire history, and so they made a submission to committee. Excuse me. And what LEAF says is that it confirms its support for an amendment that will achieve the goal of eliminating all forms of discrimination against Aboriginal women and their descendants. LEAF submits that the committee has the jurisdiction to propose amendments to the bill to achieve this end. And why do they believe that the committee has jurisdiction? Well, because the bill is very broad in its scope. So it is an act, quote, to promote gender equity in Indian registration by responding to the BC Court of Appeal decision in McIver. The response by government can and should be comprehensive and should fully eradicate any vestige of inequality in the determination of Indian status. I think that's pretty straightforward. And LEAF, you know, of course, they do have a legal eye to it, so they do call into question whether or not the committee has the jurisdiction to deal with this issue. And I think it's important that they did raise this, that they talk about if there is the jurisdiction, then this is what the committee should do. But of course, they talk about as well if there isn't the jurisdiction. So in the event that the committee determines that it is beyond its scope to propose amendments to fully eliminate sex discrimination, LEAF submits that, consistent with the submissions made by Aboriginal women and their organizations, the bill should be withdrawn and a new bill which fully redresses the discrimination suffered by Aboriginal women should be introduced. I find that very interesting, Madam Speaker. So we can amend this. I am in agreement with the idea that the committee does have the jurisdiction to do it. So we can amend, but if the committee finds it doesn't have that power, then why are we only responding to the very, very narrow situation that Sharon McIver found herself in? Why are we waiting for the next court challenge to come down the pipe and deal with the residual discrimination in the Act? On that note, Dr. Pamela Palmater, a Mi'kmaq woman from New Brunswick, who is also the chair of Ryerson University's study for the study of Indigenous governance, she made a submission to the committee as well. I'd like to read that, a part of her submission about the conclusion. Excuse me. And she says, part of the problem with Bill C-3 is how to respect gender equality in practice and not just the law. Delayed equality is not full equality. Canada fought the McIver case for over 20 years and now proposes a minimum amendment that would require another person like Sharon McIver to spend another 25 years to seek gender equality on essentially the same facts. An undefined joint process that does not have a specific mandate, clear objectives, or identified funding for widespread participation does not provide any real comfort that gender discrimination, or any discrimination, will be addressed anytime soon. And Madam Speaker, on that point, we've heard from the Parliamentary Secretary several times about this process that Ms. Palmater refers to. And there's nothing bad about this further exploration process. That's fabulous. Let's explore away. Let's come up with great ideas. Let's be visionary and think about the future. But we don't need to actually envision the future when it comes to this bill. We don't actually need to pull in the best ideas on how to make this bill better, because they're already here. All of the best ideas came forward to committee about how to actually address gender discrimination under this section of the Indian Act. It's stunning to me that we're not seizing this opportunity. I had the pleasure of sitting in on committee, it was either last week or 2 weeks ago, and the CBA, when they appeared before committee, and I read their recommendation. They've even drafted the section for us on how we can make this better and stronger. And of course, when they made their submission, and I saw the writing right there in black and white about how to change the act, I thought, oh, that's a great idea. These CBA folks are pretty smart, and thank goodness they came, because now we're going to fix the bill. Well, I certainly was wrong, and I certainly was surprised, because I find it mind-boggling that we wouldn't actually go forward and to bring that provision in. Back to Ms. Palmater's submission. At the end of her submission, I want to read this to the House. She said, "Let's try to get it right this time. My children are counting on you to uphold Canada's commitment to gender equality and human rights, both in the letter and in the spirit." I think that that says a lot, Madam Speaker. Those are very heartfelt words from Ms. Palmater about what we need to do here. On that, I think I will wrap up. So in conclusion, Madam Speaker, I strongly support this motion by the member from Nanaimo Cowichan. I am thrilled that she brought it forward. I applaud her for bringing it forward. It was the smart thing to do. It was the right thing to do. I am completely baffled as to why we're not actually taking the recommendations of, as my colleague from Labrador said, every single person who came forward at committee. Every single one of them said, this is what's got to change. This is how we can actually seize the moment and address gender discrimination, and we're not doing it. I stand here wondering why, and I hope that my colleague is successful in this motion. Thank you.
Questions and comments?